So much. Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Okay, that was terrible. Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Okay, a little better. I'm not going to make you do it again. It's fine. So I'm here to talk to you about design systems, and I'm really excited to get into it. As Eric just went over, this is who I am on the internet. You can find me at UNA. That's just my Twitter handle. It's like unicorn, so I like to keep reminding people of that because I love unicorns. I love this little illustration. I am a Google Developer Expert. This is my podcast, Toolsday. You can go to toolsday.io. It's every other week. We talk about web tech tips and tricks. That's my company, BDG. We have a variety of digital media companies that we're relaunching, rebuilding, redesigning all the time. And I recently also started a YouTube channel where I talk about tech and fashion and life. So that's all good, but you're here today to hear about design systems. So this is the more important part of who I am. I've also worked at Watson at IBM. I worked at IBM Bluemix, and I worked at DigitalOcean. And the thing that these all have in common, other than the color blue in their logo, is design systems. Design systems that I've worked on, built for them, reiterated on, have learned a lot of lessons from. And right now, design systems are so popular. At this conference, I'm so surprised to hear that we have 3 talks about design systems and the various aspects of them. And it's because they've become so prevalent in our work today. Modularization of code and components has gone hand in hand with the modularization of design elements. So it allows us to think about web development in a more systematic way. And not just allows us to think of it that way, but we have to think of it that way in order to keep up with today's fast-paced, changing tech environment. Keeping your components modularized helps to keep them up to date with technologies and frameworks and helps change them in and out. And you might see a lot of different systems popping up. There's a lot of big companies that are working on these systems. There's Carbon from IBM that I'll be talking about, MailChimp, the Lightning design system that was from Salesforce, Zendesk, Zen Garden, I love that name. Governments have design systems. Gov.uk has a design system. This is Code for America's design system. They're all thinking about design in this new scalable, modular world. If you want some really good examples and resources, styleguides.io and also Awesome Design Systems are just some really good resources for further exploration into this field. Awesome anything on GitHub is usually just a list of really good resources, so I'd recommend checking that out, and also styleguides.io. But in this talk here today, we're going to go through a lot of different aspects of design systems and working with one, building one, integrating your team into one. We're going to talk about what exactly is a design system, all the different aspects that encompass them, why design systems fail, and then within that, some execution details of how to prevent the failure. And then finally, we'll talk about actual steps, insights for getting started with building your own design system. So what is a design system? I think that you all have a good understanding of a design system in general after Yesenia's really great talk yesterday. But now I want to dive into various aspects that design systems encompass and explore those from more of an engineering and product development perspective. So a design system can be a lot of different things. It can be a style guide or visual pattern library. It can be design tooling. It can be a component library. It can be code usage guidelines and documentation. A design system can be design usage documentation. It can be an animation language or voice and tone guidelines. So let's get started with this first one, and that's the style guide or visual pattern library. Now this isn't something new. This is sort of laying out colors, logo usage. We've been doing this in the design world for a long time. When I was in college, we had to create a corporate visual identity, a style guide. So I decided to go with edible arrangements. We had to do like this rebrand. It's like a typical university project. It was a lot of fun. So I decided to take mine online and create like a little website where I showed logo usage, spacing, brand assets, incorrect usage, photography with the logo, typography, web layout, like colors. And these are a lot of the things that we're seeing in component systems today. This is just taking a print design system, a style guide, and putting it on the web. So that's just the start of what design systems are today. Design systems are also design tooling. This is an example from Primer, which is GitHub's design system, where they have this big sketch file with examples of iconography, colors, some of their components like buttons, drop-downs, usage for those things, so that their designers have access to these primitives that they can pull into their designs when they're creating component systems, web pages, etc. It's also a component library. Now, these are the core components in production or prototypes of those actual items, elements within the system. So for BUI, the DigitalOcean design guideline, we had one of these websites with headers. We had all of these different components. Here's like interactions with the components. Also described how you could interact with them, so different events within JavaScript, the hooks that you can use to hook into those events, the functions you can use to hook into those events. All these things are part of the component library, the core of how you can use your design system. Then there's also code usage guidelines and documentation. And people don't often think about this as a part of a design system, but it very, very much could be. And what I mean by this is a great example is Airbnb's JavaScript style guide. This is one of the most popular JavaScript style guides out there, and it enforces rules when you're actually writing your code. So you can set up ESLint with the configuration for Airbnb. You can configure stylint, so you can parse both your JavaScript and CSS and make sure that it's all uniform throughout your entire company. And this becomes even more important as your team grows, as your company grows, and a lot of different people are writing code. You want to make sure that it looks the same, feels the same, before it even goes to the step where you're pushing it to GitHub to have it run through linters before it can even be checked off as valid to be merged in. Like, this is a great step to include as a part of your design system. Then there's a design usage documentation. And I think that this is really important. So in Carbon, they have a really good example of just the drop-down. So drop-down, when user needs to pick one option from list, OK, we get that. But then they go into more detail. They talk about filter drop-down. And they specify when a list contains more than 25 items, use filtering to help find options from the list. So they're giving their engineers these parameters, and they're saying, OK, if this has more than 25 items, use a filter drop-down. And not just engineers, but also designers. This becomes a how-to for the company to understand how they're going to be using components, when they're going to be using components. For the loading example, they say, the waiting experience is a crucial design opportunity. Although it may not be obvious what's occurring on the back end, we can communicate clearly to reassure the user that progress is happening. And that's really important, because that increases trust from the user and increases perceived performance, that things are moving, things are happening. Having usage guidelines also increase trust because of uniformity of the product. It feels more cohesive and professional, even though multiple teams of designers and developers are working on it. Next is animation guidelines. So I'm going to go back to IBM's Carbon design system and talk about this as a great example, because they really draw inspiration from their own heritage for their animations. And I think that's really unique and special. They also talk about when to use these animations. So they talk about orientation, awareness, navigation, storytelling. They bring all these reasons to use animation to make it really meaningful. And we'll hear more about animation in Val's talk, but this is just a brief glimpse of how you can incorporate that into your design system. So as an example, they use the magnetic tape unit to inspire their loaders, that round movement, their multifunction card machine to inspire drop-down menus, and drawer animations to inspire those side-to-side like pop-ins. Like sometimes you see like, let us help you like chat or sign up for something. They're getting inspiration from their own heritage, their own products. So they're getting inspiration from the real world, which is, I think, important for us to keep in mind as designers and developers as we're building UIs to make sure that all of our UIs don't look the same. And finally, I want to talk about voice and tone guidelines. And the best example of this is clearly MailChimp, who has voice and tone guidelines and a whole website surrounded with this topic and devoted to this topic. They have a content style guide in which they say it's easier to describe what they're not instead of what they are. So they kind of do both. For the MailChimp style guide, they say that they're fun but not silly. They are confident but not cocky. They are smart but not stodgy, informal but not sloppy, helpful but not overbearing, expert but not bossy, and weird but not inappropriate. MailChimp has a sense of humor, so feel free to be funny when it's appropriate, when it comes naturally to you, but don't go out of your way to make a joke. Forced humor can be worse than none at all, so if you're unsure, keep a straight face. In this example of tone, they're discussing how you're saying something. Voice is describing what they're saying. So having these guidelines of how to talk to your users is a very important part of your design system, of how your product is perceived. Here is their voice and tone guideline, which is at voiceandtone.com. And they do a really great job of just showing the world what this could look like. So here, this is for loyal users who are Twitter or Facebook followers. They have tips like, be appropriate, turn off scheduled posts during news events. Sometimes you have to be reminded of these things. They have example interactions of users and how MailChimp can respond. Here's an example of a company newsletter. So whoever is on this company newsletter, they have these feelings. They're curious. They trust the company already because they signed up for the newsletter. They're interested. They want to see surprise. They want to hear what's next from the company. And so it talks about being casual but helpful. And then my favorite is when they talk about this failure message. So this error state. They talk about the user being confused and stressed out and angry. And the user saying, like, what's wrong? I really need to get this campaign out. This is an understandable state. So they have these tips like offer a solution or next step, be straightforward, explain what's going on right away, don't kind of dilly-dally around the problem, be calm, don't use exclamation points or use words like alert or immediately. And also be serious, don't joke around. This is a time when people are frustrated and they want help and they're turning to you for help. So it's really cool what you can do with these voice and tone guidelines. Now for this next slide, I apologize for the weird stock image here. But who here has ever started a fitness plan in their life? Okay, yeah, a lot of us. But who here has successfully finished that fitness plan, whatever they decided was the end date? Fewer of us. There's a lot of reasons that a fitness plan can fail, but there are so many more reasons the design system can fail because it requires that kind of commitment and unity with so many more people involved. And I think that there's a lot of correlations that we can make here. So let's define what design system means in terms of failure for the purposes of this talk. And it's a very simple definition of a design system failing for me, and that is that nobody uses it. This is the primary factor. Usage. Who's using the system? Is it helping people do their job? Are the goals of the design system being achieved? If nobody's using it, then you can't have it be helping people. You can't have it be improving performance. You can't have it be doing any of those things that you are hoping for it to do or hypothesizing for it to do. So I want to take you a little bit back in time and tell you a little story about my last job at DigitalOcean. The new Doctor Who just came out too, by the way. Anybody saw that? Yeah, a couple of you. So when I was at DigitalOcean, there were a few design systems floating around at different states of completion. When I joined, we had this system called Buoy V1. And then I joined as we were building another system called Float. And by the time I left, there was a third system called Buoy V2. And it was very confusing because when you said them out loud, it was the same name, but they were spelled differently. So pro tip, don't name different design systems the same thing. That's just a thing I learned. But it also reminded me of a very poignant XKCD comic at this point in time, which is this one, How Standards Proliferate. Situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14, ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Yeah, soon. Situation, there are 15 competing standards. The first system was created for the product, so the dashboard, the cloud control app. And then the second system was a separate system that was created for marketing. And the problem was that first system, people just weren't using it, and it was causing this code cruft. And now we had the second system, and it was really, really confusing. So I wanted to dive in and figure out what was going on here. When I did an audit, I found that 96 kilobytes of the existing CSS was the design system, which is relatively big, but that was only 28% of the total CSS, signaling that most of the CSS was just overrides and additional components on that initial system. People were just overriding it instead of using it to their advantage. There were 57 unique font sizes, 14 Z indices, 121 unique color declarations, and 19 unique font family decorations. And there were only like 3 fonts that we were using. I don't know how that happened. So there was a lot of room for improvement. And more importantly, I wanted to know why people were just adding on to the system. Was it an education thing? Was it that it wasn't working for them? Why wasn't anyone speaking out? They were just building on top of it. Happy design systems scale good standards. They build in accessibility. They unify component style. They unify component code. They reduce code craft. They speed up product delivery. And these are all good things. This is the happy path. So if you're wondering, how could developers not use a design system that exists when there's so many benefits? Why is this happening? The answer is simple. It's just because we're all being judged on different metrics. Most people aren't being judged on writing really clean code. They need to build features and push updates because their job depends on it. If the design systems team's goal was to make sure that code was clean, small, performance, that's great, but that is one OKR. That's what that team was evaluated on. Other people, your customer, the engineers here, are evaluated on something else, so you have to meet them halfway. You have to engage with their needs. So let's start by looking at what we should be doing to have a successful design system and prevent this state of failure. Why design systems fail? The first reason that design systems fail is because they just don't have the investment. This is something that lives on an organizational level. It's like that fitness plan that I talked about. It's going to the gym and working out. Small incremental changes lead to big gains overall. To have a successful design system, you need to make a continuous effort to invest resources into it. If you invest once in a design system, say 3 months of overhauling it, but you neglect to keep it up, you won't find much improvement after those initial gains, after that immediate gratification. People will stop using it as it becomes out of sync with new designs, and you'll end up with strange floating bits of code that nobody's using anymore. And then you'll find yourself in for another round of large investment, but dreading going through the process because it's just fallen so far out of shape. This is a crazy photo. Also, because of how design systems scale, they really make a large impact across the platform, making it extremely important to invest in things like accessibility from the start. To ensure this, it's important to have some kind of ownership, some person or some team who is looking out for this design system and ensuring its success. Having a dedicated person is a great way to make sure that you have an advocate for the system across the company, and maybe even an educator for the system across the company. You want to make sure you have a really solid base to your design system. And I wouldn't really recommend doing this. I'm more like this, where I don't always exercise, but when I do, I'll do it tomorrow. But I feel like this image also makes a really good point. It's that you just have to start sometimes. And you have to start with communication. So I went on Google and I looked up communication to find a little image for this. And I found these images. This is not communication. The second one is just straight mansplaining. And this third one, is kind of, it's not a great photo of communication, but it does show that communication is multi-directional. And that's the sort of important point that I want to make here. Communication should include as many people as possible who are involved in the process, who are outside the process, but still rely on the process. Once you have resources and a plan to invest in a design system, it's really important that this person or team acts as a bridge between design, engineering, and your users. Good communication is crucial here. And remember that nobody wants to be told a solution or prescribed a solution, especially developers who are so used to choosing their own stack and their own text editors, their own typefaces, their own systems. They want to be able to choose their own tools. So this design system has to be the best tool, or else they're not going to choose it if they can just write over it. I really want to emphasize this, that you have to ask questions. You have to listen when somebody's responding. Make your users feel heard, and then incorporate their feedback. And making your users feel heard might be the most important part of this, because even if they don't really have a say in what the buttons are going to look like or how the system is going to function, making them feel like a part of the process is going to make them so much more likely to use it and be happy about using it. That brings me to my next point, which is buy-in. This is really important, getting buy-in from your users. Getting buy-in from product management and the design team and the development team. It's a lot of people ops. You have to make them want to use your system, because at that point, when you make somebody want to use your system, that's when you can really win. It's really good to get someone to want to use a product, and they'll only use it if it's that path of least resistance. You have to show its value. Showing is much more powerful than telling. So if you can, have developers use your product, use your design system in a low-stakes situation which provides clear benefits. And that's why I really like hackathons for this. I think hackathons are like candy to a budding design system. People can really see it, use it in a low-stakes situation, and it also can be a great place for feedback or as a morale booster for the team that's building the design system. We released the design system, and for my hackathon project, I helped people use it, and people really, really loved it. They felt like it was an unfair advantage. It felt like it was a huge boost for them or a boon, and this was great, seeing all of your hard work making an impact. After the hackathon, more people had heard about our design system, the solution that we created, and the word just sort of spread on its own, even people who hadn't used it during the hackathon itself. And this is my favorite moment that occurred a few weeks after the hackathon. So what had happened is somebody had replaced Bootstrap with our design system, which allowed them to remove 20,000 lines of code and just write 59 lines of code to get the custom UI that they were wanting out of it. These kinds of moments where people explore on their own and feel empowered are the kinds of moments that get people on your side to use the design system, which will then help their products scale and grow. They see it firsthand. Speaking of this, of seeing your products scale and grow, is my next point, which is having a solid architecture. Build it so that it can grow. Build your system with scalability and change in mind, which includes using composable molecules. I came across this example of Primer, which uses a core system that was kind of similar to what we were thinking about for the initial iterations of the buoy design system. And this is exactly the type of separation of concerns that I'm talking about. Having your core, which can be pulled into your product design systems and your marketing systems, and having it just be really interchangeable. So even if there are separate product needs, you could still use the same core systems, ensuring consistency across all boards. So in their core system, they have base, breadcrumbs, buttons, forms, layouts, navigation, utilities, tooltips. And then in product, they have additional things like alerts, avatars, which they won't need on their marketing sites, subheads, support, labels. In marketing, they have marketing buttons, which build on top of buttons, additional types of tables. So this is like the idea for what we were building with Buoy, and that was having different modules and components for all these things. So having our linters, our rules, as a separate component that you pulled into your system to make sure that the code was uniform across all the boards, making sure we had core variables, base elements, and then pulling those into utilities, grids, icons. We had separate vendor libraries, and then at the time it was built in Ember, and we had Ember components and then our regular JavaScript components sort of built out, and then those would pull into all of the other sites that they needed to use. Now all these were separate repos that you can maintain. You can also put them in a single repo. The architecture of this is totally up to you, but just the idea of how you break things up and use them composably, interchangeably. So separate utility classes were great because then you could take something as core as a button and write utility classes on top of it and use dev tools to preview that. So design really liked that because you can just click on and off these classes inside of dev tools. And then if you start to pre-write and you pull in your style sheet, it pre-fills the class name so you can see what all the options are. So using dev tools to prototype was a nice little thing that we did. Semantic versioning is also something that I've used on every single design system that I've ever worked on. And this is a system of major.minor.patch versioning for any updates. So you can use semantic versioning for GitHub versioned updates, and then also you can use this for your visual designs in Sketch if you have a Sketch component library and a GitHub component library to make sure they're on the same version. So what this means is if you have like a small bug fix that doesn't really change anything, that would be a patch version update. If you have a minor update, like adding a new component that doesn't break any of the existing components, but just adds to the system, it will be a minor version bump number. So any of these can be various numbers, like it can be like 1.30, 1.102. And then major updates for anything that broke an existing component. By versioning our design system, we made sure that people who were building products built on older versions of the design system didn't have their product break when we made major version updates. They could still use older versions and then slowly roll out to updating it to newer versions. And this was really important when I was working on design systems at IBM because it was a long, slow rollout for companies and teams, for product teams to incorporate our design system. And so they were using a version for a long time and then would eventually update to a different version, or they'd need a different type of button. Then at that point they could upgrade, but it was still a very organized manner in which the company was creating this product internally for our engineers. For our built CDN assets, which I'll talk about a little bit later, we had a deploy script that automatically created folders for every single release as we versioned these updates. And a latest folder as well if somebody just wanted to work with the latest like beta up-to-date version of the design system, so that there was a lot of different ways to make sure that different versions of the design system were up to date. One thing I will say is don't wait to namespace your system. You might run into collision. And what I mean by that is we built our system using Sass. That's what was the main build tool at the time when I first started working in design systems space. And when you have something called a class of button, your likelihood of overriding something else that was class of button just increases significantly. But if you namespace that to like Bluemix-button or Buoy-button, that risk decreases a lot because it's more obvious what that class is doing. Now there's things like CSS modules or CSS and JavaScript, different libraries that also fix this problem. They live with the components, they're tied with the components themselves, but it really just depends on what your build system is for making sure that you don't break your style classes by overriding those namespaces. That's the thing that's really important. So consider your tech stack. What other companies are doing, it widely varies based on their needs. Like I said, this is very much a personal what your company needs problem. Solid by BuzzFeed uses Sass, Atomic CSS, a float-based grid, and no JavaScript. I'm not saying this is the solution. I'm just showing you as an example of a design system that includes no JavaScript and is purely visual with CSS for styles. For Carbon, there was Sass, BEM, no specified grids. There wasn't really like a physical layout system, but all of the components lived in React and vanilla JavaScript. There were also sketch templates, design documentations, and a voice and tone guideline. AtlasKit by Atlassian has CSS and JS. It's very React-based. There's no specified grid. They just went all in on React because their product is built on React, and they didn't see any other needs, or at least that was the first choice for where they were going with how they wanted to build their product and design system. So it really just depends on your personal needs. The other tough thing about design systems is that design tooling isn't really solved yet. There's a lot of people and a lot of teams that are working on this problem. I know that InVision has their design systems manager. Airbnb tried to solve this with React Sketch app, where they have the ability to write out React code and convert it into Sketch components. But it's still a space that doesn't really work perfectly right now with this transition of visual design to code. So it's a struggle, but this sort of also brings me to my next point, which may be the most critical, and that's reducing friction. Reducing friction sort of sums up all the other points I made here about empathy and communication and thinking about your user when building a design system. You have to make your system the path of least resistance, and that means lowering this cognitive overhead of development, not adding to it. If a new design system is harder to use than a current system, people won't use it. And this could change some of the decisions that you make. If your design system is overly complicated and over-engineered, again, it's not going to be used. And that's another thing that I learned. So one of the things that we started doing with Buoy was we provided this implementation method that was very specific with Sass. So that was option one. You could implement it into a development environment using Sass, select just the components you wanted to use. So we had this list of components to make sure that the code was really, really small when it was put out there. And you had to include all the components that you wanted. It was extensible using a hook system. There's a lot of little technical things that we did there to make the design systems team happy while providing a lot of control for the developers. But not everybody wanted to work that way, and that was some of the most immediate feedback that we got. Not everybody wanted to include a dependency if they didn't have to, which in this case was Sass, and learn new syntax. If you're building a React-based design system, people aren't going to include React on their product just to use it. That doesn't make any sense. So the second thing we did was we created some CDN assets that were just JavaScript and CSS assets that people could then use and then include that into their product by having links. And that's what I was mentioning earlier with the built CDN versions that would update with every instance of our design system versioning updates. And this became really popular, especially for prototyping and hackathons. So while we wanted everyone to use option one, that might have not been the path of least resistance for engineers, and that might not have been the best solution for the whole team. So it's important to keep an open mind and keep that user in mind when you're doing this kind of thing, when you're making these architecture decisions. The best time to build a design system is while a product is evolving, but they can also be built in retrospect as well. If you want to reduce friction, specifically here, then it's always easier to start earlier, and there's no time like the present, because I know it's not always possible to start at the very beginning when you're starting to develop a product system in a visual library. So there's a chart here. Anyone have any guesses to what this chart is of? It's house prices in New York. So even after the recession, house prices went up. That's the red line. Isn't that crazy? Even as median renter income went down. But this chart is also a great visual representation of bugs, cruft, inconsistencies in your code base over time, and what happens here. Usually bugs only increase over time, just like New York rent prices. It's insane how that's happening. So you need to make sure there's a way to find your bugs and squash them, and make sure there's a mechanism in place so that you're consistently revisiting your code to ensure code quality. This is something that's going to happen. So how are you, as a development team and as a design team, solving this? And when I mean bugs, I don't just mean technical bugs, I mean visual bugs too. That's going to happen as things change, as your product evolves. There was a design systems meetup in New York, speaking of which, and the theme of that was empowering product growth with design systems. And I really like that sentiment. I think that's a great way to think about this overall and how to consider the benefits of having a design system. So by considering these 5 things, investment, communication, buy-in, having a solid architecture, and reducing friction, it can help you on your quest to make a successful design system that bolsters product growth. And that brings me to the last part of my presentation, which is the practical steps that you might want to use to create a design system. And I'm just going to go over what we did for Buoy. There's so many different ways that you can build a design system now, especially with technologies changing, and making that a part of your process is a big part of it. But the first thing is, before we even get into the code, and that's thinking about the purpose of your system and why you have it. So you can hypothesize. We are building a design system because we want to increase page performance. That's a great reason. We want to decrease design inconsistencies. We want to decrease code cruft and bugs. We want to decrease the code base size. And maybe we want to increase the speed of delivery time for developers because they'll have these pre-created components. These are all measurable metrics that give you a starting point from which to justify your system and to measure it on. Measurable metrics is the key here. Having something that you as a team can go from point A to point B. So from that, you can review what you've got. You can audit your performance, your CSS, your accessibility. If your goal is to increase page performance, web page test is a great place to sort of profile your before and afters. I have side-by-sides of the previous iteration of the website before we implemented a design system, and then afterwards. We increased the load time by 2 seconds, almost 2 seconds. Repeat view by the same rate. The start render speed index went down by 3,000 points. So having things like this help to justify having your resources being focused on creating a design system. If you want to decrease accessibility bugs, there's webaim.org where you can just put your website in and see all your bugs. To do this in our process, I went to pally.org and I used this Pally dashboard. I wrote a blog post about how to set one up. So over time, we could see the decreases in errors and warnings for accessibility in our product because it was constantly pulling our a few different pages on our site, and it creates this great dashboard. And that's how we kind of saw our accessibility changes over time. This is like one of the first times we had really implemented this in the site. We just saw them go down immediately, and that was really great. If your goal is to decrease design inconsistencies, or decrease your code base size, or decrease code bugs and craft, CSS Stats is a really, really great tool. We were able to get our website down from 306 kilobytes to 80 kilobytes by implementing a design system. And the rules down by like over 2,000 rules. There were just so many things that were in this website that we were able to improve on by creating a design system and implementing the design system. There was 150 unique colors, and there were like 70 shades of gray. There were so many values on this website that people didn't even realize. It's not intentional. Nobody wants to create a slow website that has a lot of different rules. It just happens. So to sort of go through this problem and fix this, we had a color workshop. We ended up cutting out all these colors, seeing where they were on the site, deciding what colors would convert into what other colors, and we cut the grays down to 6, and we only used primary colors for the rest of the site. And this is sort of an idea from Nathan Curtis also to use this for components, where you cut up your different components, you print out your whole website, you find all your buttons, and then you decide, like, what is the ultimate source of truth? You find all of your headers, you find all of your cards, and you decide what do you want to go with moving forward. From there, we can now get user buy-in. And you use those stats that you just learned about to get that user buy-in. So here is just a slide with some links if you want to do this kind of audit to improve your design system, if you want to take a photo of this. You also have all the slides, so you can just go to this later and get some resources there. So you'll get that buy-in and a commitment to action. From there, you have to make a plan. And it really, really helps to then put that plan in writing so that it's known by everybody who needs to be involved that this is what we're doing moving forward, this is the commitment that we've made, and we need the resources for this design systems team to be able to make an impact. From there, we can start to make technical decisions. And this is where it definitely just varies a lot depending on your personal needs. But we had a lot of use cases to support for Buoy. We had marketing sites. We have sites like Hacktoberfest. So that's actually going on now. It's like throughout the month of October. If you do 5 pull requests, you get a T-shirt. We had little microsites. Then we also had the dashboard. So here's like the product dashboard itself. And so we decided to do a few different elements of our design system here to help our developers to build. And one of the things that we created was these custom properties. It was a hook-based system, so you customize your components. We had defaults, so you can create your own. We had this flexible system that uses classes to apply sizing changes. So responsive design was built into the class names. And then we also had that list that you saw earlier with all the components that you want to use to make a really performant output of your CSS code that SAS was converting into CSS. The first thing that we did was have this hook-based system where you pull in all the values from whatever base that you wanted. So you had a default button as the base, and then here we're creating button pink where we're specifying a unique color, hover and active state, and that's how we're creating this new component, but still pulling all of the core values from our initial button into it. We also had this flexible system where we applied these CSS values to create responsive styles. So at medium, the width changes of the component. And then in our documentation, we made sure to include where those would live, what those would look like. So here you can change the flex spacing and styling based on the width of your viewport. Here is just an example of that here. In this example, I have this block grid 4 at small. So since it's mobile first, it's going to be width of 100%. And then when you hit that small size going bigger, because that class is in there, it's going to then change to 4 items. And this is super, super helpful because then you don't have to write media queries all the time. And then you can just chain those in your class list, and it would change its size. And finally, we had this sort of list of components of what we wanted to include in our CSS code or not. But again, this solution might not be the one for you, especially if you're involved in other frameworks, if you're using Vue, Angular, React. Like, there's these CSS modules and JavaScript frameworks that allow for you to do this without having to create these sorts of lists or use Sass. But at the time, this was the best solution that we could have thought of, or that we wanted to give to our users. So thinking about modular code, thinking about making it as small as possible is really important part of creating a design system. And you might have different needs. So the gov.uk design system has separate areas for their prototyping design system and their production design system. So that's also something that you might want to think about. From there, you start with your atomic elements. Buttons are like the hello world of design systems. I loved what Yesenia said yesterday about how you can't really have these like abstract components. They live in a system, so it's important to think about what's being used before you decide what they look like. And that's really important too. So thinking about your system and then starting small when you're building out your UI components. So again, these are buttons, but they're not as simple as you might think. There's a lot of states for these buttons, and they also have interactions. So you have to think about the interactions too. And then from there, think about all of the different types of buttons and the utilities for these buttons. There's small buttons, mini buttons in our case. There are these icon buttons. There are these icon buttons with text. There's full width buttons, reset utilities for buttons. So it's important to think about all the use cases, where they're being used. That can also be built out as you're working throughout the design system. And also describing like when to use a link versus a button. These are important things, especially if you have juniors who are starting on your team. They might need some guidance on these really important accessibility decisions. Then we can compose elements once we have those basic elements. So this is an example of having a list, having iconography, having a block component. This one is called a split block. It was used when someone is making a droplet for the first time. It has a lot of the different elements that we had as just core components in our design system. And we're able to build this out as a more complex component because this is what the UI is made of. It's made of complex components. So you can then start to build and build and build on your system. Layout is something that is interesting because I think it's an unsolved question of if you include layout in your system. And then if you do include it, to what extent are you including it? I loved this article by Nathan Curtis. The URL's at the bottom there. But he talked about grid versus space, where with your components, you can include the space that they're surrounded in, the space that they contain, but not specify a grid specifically for layouts. And I still think that like having grid or predefined layouts is an ask that I hear a lot from people who are consuming design systems, but it's difficult to just say like, here's layout A, B, and C, unless you have a product that calls for a lot of the same layout, in which you're creating templates, essentially. From there, we can focus on interaction and accessibility. I say for every hover, you should have an equal, not opposite, focus. So whenever you have a hover state, make sure that you have a similar state for focus for any user who is using a keyboard and not just a mouse. This is just a core tenet of having accessible components. And again, it's important to think about accessibility in your design systems because of how they scale. Loaders are another example of interaction to mention in the design system. This is a part of your system, and how those loaders interact with your content. Where do they exist on the page? Do they exist on the full page? Do they exist in line? Do they exist in certain components? How do they look in different components? Facebook has an example where their loaders inside of the actual timeline look like there's a little icon there with some bars next to it, so it lives nicely within that UI. What do loaders look like in vertical spaces? What do they look like in horizontal spaces like carousels? The loaders themselves are like a really big conversation. I feel like you could have an hour-long talk just about loaders. Like there's so much within design systems that you can extend upon. From there, it's important to document design and technical usage. So a code block is a good example of this. In our design system, a code block was a place not to show code in a blog post, but a place for copying that code. So that's why documentation is important here. Like this was sort of for pop-ups where you have things that the user should be interacting with. It wasn't just like a standard visual layout. It was short bits of information there. And then we had events that lived with that code block. It included the copy. That was a part of what it was. It wasn't just a styling decision. It included events. So then you can inform your users. Once you finish your V1, people will start to use your system, and then they'll want all of their personal needs for their product covered by it and componentized. And this is where it really helps to have a team to triage those components and make sure that the base elements, after all, are base elements. And then when you do have new base elements that your team has decided are base elements, to manage those components and update older ones. This is a component status page from Carbon's design system from IBM. And there's a key here of exactly what this is doing. So they have components with tags, if it's currently under review, if it's being deprecated for older components, if the component is ready. It's a great way to keep in touch with their users who are the engineers. And you can really follow along here. So if someone requests like a new type of drop-down, they can follow along with the progress here and not have to consistently be like pinging the team, seeing what the progress is. Document the status of your component so that you can show your audience what you're working on and the state of the components that you're working on for semantic versioning, consistency. And it's not just with the users of the design system, but it's also with the builders of the design system that you have to keep consistent communication. And that's communication between your development and your design teams. So what's the ultimate visual source of truth is a question that you should ask and discuss. What is the usage for each component? When is the component inappropriate to use? What does the interaction look and feel like? How do the various states look? And how does this component interact with other components, like that loader bar? So just to sum it up, goal and hypothesis setting is the first thing that you should be doing, no matter where you are in what stage of your design system. This will help to inform your process moving forward. Reviewing what you currently have in your product. If it's a new product, this will be less of a task, but if it's an existing system, a website that's been around for 10 years even, this is going to be a lot of work to see what you have and to use that to move forward. From that, you can get user buy-in. You can make technical decisions working with your project management teams, your development teams. You can then start with your atomic elements, compose those elements into your complex UI components. Focus on interaction and accessibility as you're building those components before you ever release the system. Document design and technical usage. Inform your users about where you are in the process, and then keep consistent communication with your users. Continuous iteration, support, and communication are the most important factors to design system success. Code is only 10% of it. I know that sometimes developers think that that is what a design system is, but it's not true. And designers think a design system is solely a visual aspect of what their product looks like, but that's not true either. People ops is 80% of a working design system. That's what you need to make this successful and to make it work. Remember that slide from the beginning? I just want to remind you that while there are different solutions for different teams, that solution might not be the one for you. And that's why we have so many different design systems. It's not a single formula. It's whatever you personally need. We also can't look at these big companies and compare ourselves to those companies. We can't compare our 5-person design team to their 300-person design team. Diana Mounter had a really nice tweet about this. I like this sentiment. And she works on GitHub's design system primer. And she says that we can't compare our design systems to those polished, huge design systems of companies with big teams. It's like comparing your real life to someone else's Instagram life, their best curated version. Like, we see the struggle, and they have their own struggle, but we don't see their struggle all the time. We see this like nice, polished website, and we feel like they've got it all figured out, but we don't have it all figured out. And so it's important to reconcile that if you're not in the same place that they are. It's about your personal needs and your own product teams and working with what you have at any given time. And I'm going to say something a little controversial here, and I apologize, don't at me. You might not need a design system. And what I mean by that is, if the cost of making the system is greater than the benefit of it, then you might not need a design system. You can't be a sole advocate for a design system. So even if you're riled up and you see these numbers and like, oh my gosh, but you built one and you really improved the speed of your website and the consistency of it, that's great. But if nobody else can support you on that journey, then it's going to be a really, really tough sell. So there are things that you can do. You can show them statistics. You can show those numbers, the data. That's what C-level executives care about. They care about the data, the information. Why is this helping our company? You can do things like showing designers all the inconsistencies, get them on board. And so it's really important to have these teams support, to have company support to make a design system. Because if at any point the cost of making the system is greater than the benefit that people who are making these decisions see, the people who are making the decisions of who gets salaries, who's working on what, then it might not be worth it. You might not be at that point yet if they can't see the benefit to it. You can't be the only one rooting for this design system to work. So you have to think about what's right for your team. And this also brings me back to that gym metaphor, where not everyone enjoys the same workout, but you can still get the same results if you do something that's more tailored to your needs. Like, running isn't for everyone, but maybe swimming is right for you. BEM as a naming convention might be right for someone else, and CSS and JS might be right for someone other than that. The best design systems are evolved from your personal needs, not from someone else's examples. So take the time to really examine those needs before you take the time to look at what another team did. Find what's right for you, and then keep at it. Thank you. I think I have a couple more minutes, so are there any questions? We have a microphone here. Just raise your hand. Don't be shy. Coffee break. Here in the front, there's one.
Next month, I go on to a new project, which is a portal for basically our entire customer experience. And there's multiple apps, all using different versions of our existing design system. How can I version that?
So I think that what you can do is move forward, and what that means is start versioning it now, because you can't really undo what's been done in the past, especially if you have an existing system and people are using different versions of it. But what this means is now, when you're versioning it moving forward, whenever that team needs to update their styles, or whenever they get to a point in their project where they can make an update, they'll start using the version. And from there on, you can sort of get in line with versioning and moving forward.
Thanks.
Hey, kind of got a laryngitis thing going on, so sorry about that.
That's
but
okay.
Wanted to say, love your podcast, and I don't know how you come up with new songs every week or every time you do one, but it's
Thank
awesome.
you.
I wish I could be more spastic, and not saying you're spastic. But, anyways, I work in like a one-man shop, and my designer is very, very talented, but he's also a bit scatterbrained. So while there might be a similar like theme from page to page, oftentimes he will adjust the font size to fit the message instead of having like a unified thing. So I've inherited all these designs, and I basically had to turn it around overnight. And now I've got a big spaghetti monster mess that I would like to cull down and actually implement a design system. Is the best place to start on something like that doing the element workshop that you kind of prescribed? I think I could sell the benefits easily by just kind of showing some of the stats that you had, because most of the people there just care about speed improvements and optimization. They don't really care about how the cake gets baked. So, like, where would you start on a spaghetti monster mess? I guess
Yeah,
is my question.
I think that's a good place to start. You mentioned that there's a lot of like font size inconsistencies. Just looking at all of your components and comparing them. A big part of this is putting on a. Are you in a consultancy where you have a lot of different projects going on? Okay, so having like a professional facade where consistency is a really important part of what you're putting out is a reason to make sure that your font sizes for all your body copy is the same, or your headers look consistent. So cutting all those out, deciding what the ultimate source of truth is, like 16 pixels could be your body copy. If you see 14 pixels, does that become 16? Do you make a new variable that's 14 or 12, like finding all of these different pieces and then deciding what's the ultimate source of truth and then working from there. And then you'll see a lot of improvements with your CSS too, because you'll be getting rid of all this random cruft and magic numbers, and it'll be really nice for both design and developers.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
Hi, thanks for your talk. One of the things I'm starting to experience is we have a design system happening now within a core project. But the new push is like design ops, so trying to scale that design system across an entire organization. Can you speak to your experience about design system scaling up to cover not just one project, but an entire organization?
Yeah, so I think it's envisioning the needs of that organization. When I was at IBM, we were lucky enough to have sort of the ear of the execs who were on our side with getting our design system to scale out. Having your core system in a place that's solid and working for someone is a great start. And then you can start to talk with people who are stakeholders for those other products and seeing what their needs are. And then you can start to create additional components that will help to build out their product. From there, they can start using the core of the system in a way that you've allowed them to extend it. And then you're also at the same time creating products that they need that will then live in the system as well. So if possible, there could be a case where you want to create a system that's like really clean and small. That could be the core system. You can create another module that pulls that system in and then builds on top of it, kind of like the example I was showing with Primer, where it has core and then marketing and then their their product dashboard. So that could be a thing that you do, where you have core and then different products build on top of that core system. Yes, in the back.
Hi, thank you so much
Hi.
for your talk. My question is about time scale of the benefits of a design system and how you see, of course you see the initial benefits right up front of implementing a design system, but over time, what do you see as a kind of like a benefit to management to share?
Well, I think a big part of working on design systems is most of the work is in the initial build out if you don't have one yet, and then the amount of like salary time working on a design system can decrease over time. It's still important to have a team or people working on it, but you might not need like 12 engineers at the same time working on it. You just need an owner and someone who's keeping it consistent. So you're going to be able to maintain accessibility, performance on your sites, unity throughout your UIs, while at the same time costing the company less money to maintain it. So I think that could be something that is great for the longevity of a design system, and another reason to put the effort in at first and then keep it going throughout the duration of your product.
One last question.
One last question.
Somebody over here on this side, any chance?
I think we have a hand up here.
Oh, over there.
Back there.
Hi, so I was just wondering about like policing this and how strict you are, and you have these different components, let's say like a button, an image or something, and how the treatment of that, and you say, well, this treatment of an image is for this situation and another treatment for another situation, and then you're going to have people who inevitably will flip-flop those. And I guess, how strict do you think you need to be with that, and how do you approach people and say, we know you tried, but really you want to do this for this situation, and situations like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's hard to sort of determine what position you have to, like, what power you have to decline a pull request if it doesn't fit the design system. That's probably not something that we want to do, but if engineers are if one of their metrics is adhering to the design system, then they will adhere to it. Like, you have to make your team care, and you have to make engineers care. And that's why I think it's really important to get project management specifically involved in design systems and have a project manager for the design systems team, because then they can interface with all the other project managers and make sure that adherence to that system is a part of their, we call them OKRs, which is kind of what your metrics are as success metrics for you as an employee working within a project. So if adherence to that design system is one of those OKRs, then your entire company can benefit and blossom from having this sort of product that everyone is now using and wants to use, because they're what's that word? Incentivized to. They're incentivized to. That's the word. Okay, I think that was the last question. So I think there's a break now, if I'm correct. Awesome. So there's a break time now. Thank you all so much for your time.